Proceed.
All right, we are the Blue Men Committee on Hurricane Prevention.
You're not even blue, and you're not even a man.
I know. That's just our title.
Okay,
Just like-
just wanted to clarify.
All right, Montana will be starting us off together.
Alright, imagine what you just saw here happening in Washington, D.C., but several times worse. Imagine your careers, your homes, your families destroyed in tatters. Imagine the capital in which you work reduced to rubble, in appearance like the surface of the moon in a matter of a few hours. Imagine the entirety of America's infrastructure and government just grinding to a halt. According to the NOAA, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a hurricane, or a fully developed hurricane, contains all the destructive power of a 10 megaton atomic bomb exploding every 20 minutes. Now, let's consider Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina happened back in 2005, and it was a Category 5 hurricane, so that means way more destructive than what I just described. In damages, it caused nearly $200,000 billion. It displaced about 1 million people, 1 million Americans who never returned to their homes, which is in effect the largest diaspora in the United States history. It also killed 2,000 more people, flooded 80% of New Orleans and 90% of the Mississippi coastline, and in general absolutely caused total devastation to the United States. It is quite possibly the worst disaster in the history of the United States. And only a few years ago, we had Hurricane Sandy, which caused $74 billion in damages and affected 24 US states. It was also over 1,000 miles in diameter, which is just absolutely insane. It is considered one of the worst disasters in the history of New York's subway system. As I mentioned, $74 billion in damages, 19 billion of that alone was New York City, which is really, really close to Washington, D.C. Okay, so by this graphic, each one of these lines represents a cyclone. All the yellow are at least Category 1 hurricanes. So this on the Pacific is from 1949 and 1851 in the Atlantic. So as you can see, this is something that the United States has dealt with for a long time, or not really dealt with, but we need to learn how to deal with it because it's not going to stop.
As you can see, there's sort of a range of paths that a hurricane can take as it comes into the Atlantic, and despite this range, there do tend to be general areas along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico that have more current and are more prone to hurricane landfall. So these areas where you see the red, these are hurricane-prone areas where you have return periods of hurricanes, generally within 14 to 22 years. But what's important to note is that the entire coast can be affected, and that even up in the New York area where there is an as of now sort of expected low return rate, Sandy just hit there. Hurricane Joaquin could easily have hit there again, as we all know from the scare that posed just a couple weeks ago. And so just that these return periods are not necessarily set in stone and can easily re-affect areas that are unprepared. These storms also don't just hit sort of individual areas. They are large. They have far inland reaching effects. And that the number of these storms can easily change as we move into the future. So over the last few decades, we've seen an increase in these storms. Here we see a spike going up in 95. We start to see an increase in tropical storms and hurricanes moving into the 2000s and 2010. And this is expected to continue because we have changing events that are expected to increase. Changing weather events are expected to increase hurricane activity as we move forward. This is because one major thing is warming ocean temperature. Ocean temperatures are increasing, and this affects because hurricanes and the process of how they're created is due to warming ocean water. Warmer averages of sea surface temperature will increase hurricane, sort of the number of hurricanes created. As warmer water evaporates from the ocean, you create these circling clouds, and once you add wind, you get the swirling effect that we are all very familiar with hurricanes. So as you can see here, we've got a cold Atlantic, we've got a sort of generally warmer Atlantic. Warmer Atlantic, we have much more higher intensity hurricanes than with a colder Atlantic, and this is what we're moving towards. Another factor that's going to increase and affect how hurricanes impact the United States is rising sea levels. All along the Atlantic seaboard, we see increases in sea levels from Virginia up to Massachusetts, and with this will come increasing storm surge. When hurricanes hit, we're going to have more flooding, and as you can see in the graphic, there are many flood-prone areas all along the coast. When these hurricanes hit, they will bring increased water damage, they'll bring increased sort of flooding to areas, to subway systems, to underground areas, and it's important to note that the major cause of damage from Sandy was flooding. The New York City area was not prepared for the amount of water coming in. Sandy was only a Category 3 hurricane, and it brought large amounts of water to the area just from the storm surge alone. So all of this leads to a general increasing number of hurricanes and increasing intensity of hurricanes as we move into the future. We've got, as you can see here, we've got a general warming of the sea surface temperature, which correlates strongly with the intensity and power associated with hurricanes, and that is only expected to increase moving forward. And that's also reflected in this graphic over here, where we see an increase in Category 4 and 5 hurricanes moving towards the future.
All right, so the way that we currently finance hurricane prevention and mitigation of the negative effects is not effective or cost efficient, which is a large issue if the hurricanes are going to be raising in intensity and cost. So you can see in these two graphs that go to 2011, so it excludes Sandy, which was about $75 billion. But all of the hurricanes that have caused the most damage recently have been in the last 15 years or so. And they're relatively proportional to the amount of deaths, because when we don't spend money to prevent the negative consequences, a lot more people are going to die. We're not financing building infrastructure and other ways to keep people safe. So Kate Donahue of the Harvard Political Review raised the question that is this a function of disasters getting much larger, or how Congress has been thinking about financing disaster recovery? And her answer is that it seems like both. The hurricanes are getting worse, and our funding is not going to be effective if we continue financing hurricane mitigation the way that we are currently. So the money isn't non-existent. We have money to spend on hurricane prevention or of the negative effects. However, we don't use it. We use the money allotted for those things to use on the cleanup of the disaster. You can see that insurance companies are adopting most of the costs, which reflects that we are paying for the disaster relief and what happens after a hurricane, when really we should be spending money on rebuilding and new codes and everything so that these costs don't exist on the other side. And over the last 15 years, we've added it up in our committee, and we have spent nearly $400 billion on hurricane disaster relief. And that's an issue, because if we just take that large amount of money and we allot it before the hurricanes arrive, we can mitigate a lot of the costs after, and we will not be spending nearly as much. It would be an investment to spend more money now so that we don't have to later. Okay, this kind of reflects what I just said. You can see the hazard mitigation grants is by far the smallest amount spent on hurricane relief. You can see how much we spend after the hurricanes come, and these numbers on the top would go way down if we spent more on the bottom, in the front hand. Some of the goals of FEMA and their national preparedness standards are what's stated above, and you can see that there's 3 priorities reflect things that we should be doing before the disaster, and the second 2 are responding to the disaster. And those would not necessarily be as important if we deal with the first ones. This is Kate Donahue again, and it's a good quote. And she says, "We simply can't afford to keep facing such disastrous events unprepared. The stakes are high, billions of dollars for large-scale disasters, which with climate change are likely to happen more frequently. The challenges should concern not only those who are directly impacted, but anyone who lives in the United States and pays taxes. Disaster recovery is a complicated and intriguing financial puzzle." And most people don't realize the far-fetching effects of hurricanes because they generally happen on the Atlantic coast. However, from a hurricane, or a level 5 hurricane such as Katrina, nearly 24 states picked up the burden of the disaster and the cost. And not only that, a lot of the people that are affected directly will move elsewhere, and then there's indirect effects in the long run as well. Okay.
So, as we have seen, future hurricanes have the potential to cause even greater damage, thus costing even more than past hurricanes. Major cities, including New York City and Washington, D.C., are at risk for facing damage and devastation from future hurricanes. If a hurricane the size of Sandy hits New York City again in the near future, it could cost 4 times as much, as they have mentioned. So mitigation, cleaning up after these hurricanes, is no longer enough. We need adaptation now. Scientists have come up with many possible strategies and ways to adapt to the simple fact that climate change is happening, ocean levels are rising, hurricanes are increasing in frequency and in strength. So, what can we do? The best thing would be to retreat inland, and careful, managed, and planned retreat where instead of cities continuing to build on vulnerable coastal floodplains, they move back the residential districts, the business districts, important buildings such as hospitals and government offices that in many major cities, including New York, are in very vulnerable areas, and they move these inland to more secure areas that won't be harmed by future hurricanes. Unfortunately, that's not happening. Currently, according to recent census reports, over 25% of the U.S. population lives in coastal areas and vulnerable floodplains, and approximately 1 million people move to these areas each year. The reverse needs to happen. This solution seems to scare many people, but it is entirely feasible and in the long run will be more economically beneficial and save many lives. According to an article from 2014 in the New York Times, sea levels are expected to rise around New York City up to 2 feet in the next 40 years, and over 800,000 residents are at risk of flooding and hurricane damage. This is enormous. In order to manage these retreats inland, cities can change their zoning laws and regulations to encourage growth in other parts of the city and lessen growth in vulnerable areas. Additionally, cities can change building codes requiring that all existing buildings and infrastructure are updated and refitted to be prepared for the potential impacts of large storms, including wind and flooding. And then new buildings can also be built up to these new standards. Communication and power lines need to be moved. Subway and transportation systems also need to be updated and refitted to be prepared for the potential impacts of hurricanes and flooding. And with new land left empty after managed retreats inland, these spaces can be used to provide natural barriers to hurricanes. Restoration of natural wetlands and planting back native plants in these areas will serve as a natural barrier to prevent flooding and hurricane damage. Restoring wetlands and oyster reefs will be particularly effective in cities like New York. A study published all the way back in 1995 in Environmental Management suggests that for states such as Florida, protecting and enhancing natural existing features such as dunes and floodplains, wetlands, and beach renourishment will help prevent effects of future hurricanes. Unfortunately, this has not been done enough, so communities continue to be affected. FEMA has also released reports saying that improved vegetation cover, natural plants, and also have the effect of reducing landslides and soil erosion in addition to preventing hurricane damage. Unfortunately, these four really good solutions scare a lot of city managers and city developments, and people like to rely on existing structures. The problem with this is that many of these structures were built in the 20th century to face 20th century climate problems. However, as we've discussed, future hurricanes are going to get stronger and stronger. If we're going to continue to rely on these old structures, some of which were built in 1972, as you can see from this plan for Brooklyn and New York City, we need to update them so that they'll be prepared for 21st century sized storms. We can't rely on these old, unreliable structures. We all heard what happened to New Orleans, for example, when they did not pass a vote to update their levees and were absolutely destroyed by the hurricane. If we're going to stick with these old methods, which we can only do in the short run because ocean levels will continue to rise, so this will only be feasible for a few more years, we need to update these existing systems. These may seem like huge challenges to confront, but the disaster management coordinator for the International Federation of the Red Cross said that in 2013, for every $1 spent on disaster prevention efforts, $4 will be saved in disaster response. So this is a huge payoff, not to mention the lives that will be saved if we can adapt to the reality that hurricanes are increasing in frequency and in their destructive potential.
Okay, so let's just return to the visual that well, let's listen to some music now. Let's return to the visual that Montana started us with. So if we don't start taking action to mitigate these storms, let's just think about what the effects of something like this would be on Washington, D.C. Imagine the damage it would cause after all the examples we've given, the number of deaths, the amount of time it would take for us to recover. How would our government even be able to continue if it takes 10 years for when a storm hits for us to find a solution and kind of get back, find a new normal? We saw what Sandy did to New York City, and that's so close to Washington, D.C. And with over 25% of the population moving to these coastal cities, the effects and the deaths, they're only going to increase. This is also, the increase in storms is also affecting insurance, which we talked about a little bit. People living in these areas are now struggling to be able to afford insurance because the insurance rates are going up. And this doesn't only affect the families after disasters hits, but is making an impact on the economy, because if people can't afford insurance, then people are not going to be employed in these jobs. So this is a lot bigger than just these storms are going to affect the land on these coastal cities. So let's start adapting. We can update building codes, we can alter the environment to reduce the exposure to these hazards, we can update the levee systems. No one needs another Katrina situation where we haven't updated levees. We voted a bill down and then only a few years later this has caused major destruction and we're recovering 10 years. There are other things we can do. These storms are inevitable, so we have to take action now so we don't have to spend more money recovering, which is what Rachel talked about. We've seen this, we can't keep waiting for the next disaster to happen. A hurricane could hit, it could be next week, it could be next year. We need to take advantage of the time we have to mitigate the effects now and to start adapting. Every day is a day we could be making these hurricane-prone areas safer and be taking steps. I hope you strongly consider this proposal. Thank you.